Happy Thursday.
Howdy.
I think people are getting too used to starting 5 minutes after. So they're all showing up 5 minutes late. Maybe we just start a few minutes early and just throw everybody off. We got Phil to join. It's a rare Thursday. You must have had a canceled meeting. Should we start talking about the artifact stuff first and then circle back to the subject field? Giving people a few minutes to show up for that part.
Hey, I think I finally picked the right mic. There we go.
There it is. Hey, Phil.
No, I was just gonna say I think I may have successfully moved things around to be here a little more often. So
Awesome. Welcome back to the regular meeting then. Okay, well, I think we're getting enough people here. We can just go ahead and start with the normal stuff. In that case, I will not go out of order. And so how about we talk about registries and whether or not they should be rejecting an unknown subject digest? Has anybody had a chance to look at the stuff Bjorn and myself and Derek kind of went over on that one? Guessing by the silence and lack of people voting on that issue that the answer is nobody's had time, which
I was
is
kind of theorizing that maybe people wanted to wait until they discussed it live to vote, but so you know the idea here is for anybody playing catch up is that we've had this disagreement over what is reasonable or what is practical, especially with trying to get 1.1 out the door. So what we've tried to do is summarize basically what different options to resolve issue 459 are, and what the different pros and cons might be, so that hopefully it's easier to reason about for those who haven't been reading every comment on the thread and in every one of these calls.
another way I'd phrase this chatting just the other day is that I think a lot of the disagreement here comes down to the two sides here viewing the DAG structure a little differently. And so we've got Docker, and I'm assuming ECR as well, is viewing the DAG as if the subject field is in the manifest, then the DAG starts at whatever manifest contains that subject field. And so your signature or something like that, they're saying that would be the root of the DAG structure, and that the image that was signed would be a child object of that. And from the client side, since we don't pull it in that direction, the logic there, the way the client's tree is, as tree has two separate DAGs that are linked, and you go from the image to something like the signature. And so you walk from the image down. And depending on which way you view that data structure, the consistency model around this changes for the two parties. So the consistency model for clients is there are some nice use cases if you can have the assurance, and this isn't if, this isn't a will, because the whole model of having the reverse is that somebody can extend it later on. But when I think about the normal CI pipelines and other stuff to do all the builds up front, push the stuff up to a registry, you've got a good high confidence from a lot of tooling out there that you're going to have a lot of this data pushed up front all at once. And if you can guarantee the order on that, you can get things back to the way that we've been used to, which was that you could always query a simple head request on that digest and know that everything you've copied locally is the same as everything that's already up on the server. If you change the data structure in the data model and you start putting the signature up on top and you require that being pushed first, you get these weird ordering situations where things could act a little funny. So hopefully that brings people up to date if we're still trying to get there. From the Docker side, they're looking at and saying, well, we have a strict data structure. The subject field is in there. It's therefore part of the DAG. And anything in there that tries to move outside of that causes consistency concerns from their side, I think. So the current spec says that registries must allow us to push that before the image is there. So it was taking the client-side view. And so the no change option, the con of that is that people like Docker Hub and ECR may not be conformant on their registries with this feature. And on the pro side, you'll have clients out there that could do the simplified, but again, not on all registries. There is a option that we've been proposing, which says that clients could potentially use a tag to be kind of the way I've been looking at. Well, sorry, tags later on. That's if we change it. This one is saying that registries themselves could decide to implement something that's not quite OCI, but close enough that clients probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference unless they're really looking hard, where they could implement kind of a built-in transaction on these requests so that anytime a upload is seen with a subject field and that subject field doesn't exist, they could just generate their own built-in transaction at that point saying, I'm seeing something here as part of a bigger upload. Let me wait for the whole thing before I make it available. And so until that upstream manifest appears, it just holds this in its own little quarantine place until that's done. So theoretically, they could implement something like a transaction API without actually having that done by the spec, and that would give them a way around this. From the flip side, we were looking at it from the should side. So if you change the text to should, it means that the registries could reject this if a client tried to push it out of order from their view. And in that scenario, then clients are no longer going to be able to make that assumption. So they couldn't assume that that digest meant that all the other content was pushed ahead of time for them. And so because they can't make that assumption, you get some weird scenarios where if you ever want to verify everything, even if things should have been pushed all up front, you now need to walk this stuff recursively just to make sure nothing happened there where you had an out of order scan where the digest appeared before all the content that was referencing that digest. And so that recursion is something that concerns me a lot. It's one of those things where if I write tooling that's copying content from one registry to another, that causes problems. I know the notation group has also been concerned with that because they want the ability to push the signature before the actual signed content. That way that as soon as someone tries to pull that signed content down, they've got that, it's already signed in their case. And so this is where one of the recommendations came out that we could just have a tag. And when the tag appears, you know that all the content is there. And so you push by digest ahead of time. And then when you're all done finally pushing everything, then you push your tag. And so that lets you put that manifest up there, put all the content around it, and then push the tag for that same manifest. It's an extra push of one manifest. They're usually pretty small. Theoretically, it could get up to 4 megabyte, but I think that's a pretty rare scenario. So that's the second option. And then the third option is we just leave this as a must, but we implement a transactional API. And this is kind of option one, but I think this is hinting much more at we do need to implement a transactional API. It's not something we're just wishful thinking about. It's something that we say that we really need to implement there, and that's probably going to be a 1.2. And the downside of that is it means that a couple registries are probably not going to be conformant for the 1.1 release, but they'll catch up on a 1.2 release. So I caught everybody up. Any questions with what we were just going over? And is there a whole bunch of discussion that I've been missing because I didn't have it up? No discussion. Questions or concerns, though? Or comments?
I like the idea of a transactional API, but yeah, I think it's probably take a long time to agree on what that would look like.
See Ron with a hand up. Ron, if you're talking, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. So just a question, right? So for option number one, is there something that clients can do as a workaround, meaning that if you're talking to Docker Hub or ECR, then do this, everyone else do that?
I would say the workaround would be tags. You don't get the same semantics, but if you're okay with using tags to control your visibility, then, this is like, if you consider tags to be the way that people will discover your digests and not necessarily some out of band, like copy and pasting something around, then I think it is fine to say that, you don't push the manifest with a tag until you're satisfied that all your referrers are up. And there is also kind of this is like more of a philosophical thing, but one can argue that tag is just a byword for digest discovery. So it doesn't have to be a literal tag in the registry. So what I'm saying is, say you do everything by digest, don't notify your downstream CI job that there's a new digest until your upstream CI job is satisfied that all the referrers are present in the registry, etc. But there's not a world in which you wouldn't have the special case or you wouldn't get the same semantics with the implementation of Hub today. There's not like a one-to-one workaround or anything.
Yeah, so that may be okay, actually, in reality, because if you're encouraging the visibility by digest, because that's really the only way you can figure out immutability and things like that, then maybe it's okay to push it by digest, do other things with the digest, and then do a announcement based on tag.
Yeah, or like I was saying, you don't necessarily have to use tags at all. It's just that whatever downstream processes discover that digest, should it be informed of that digest until you think everything is there. And that could be tags, but that could be another mechanism.
That's fine, yes. I think that's fine. So maybe it's not too bad. That's all I had.
There was another hand up there a minute ago. Jorn, do you want to talk a little bit about Docker's logic around the difference in we're coming to of the data model and why Docker is looking at this from like a garbage collection other viewpoint of why it needs to have that as the top of the tag?
I think Derek, if you're able, might actually be a little better suited to do that, but
Wait, what specifically?
Kind of why this needs to be a single DAG with the signature at the top and not treat as two separate distinct DAGs and two
I
separate
mean,
manifests.
that's how it's defined in the image spec. So we don't define what the DAG is, only it's the relationship. It points, the hash is generated first from the manifest, and that that digest is used in the referrer, so that's just how it's defined. I don't know. It's not like we're
Yeah.
creating the DAG. I mean, that's what a Merkle tree is. I mean,
Yeah, because the content digest is saying that content exists, right? But then if you were to go and like get or head that blob or manifest, it wouldn't exist if it's not in there. It's if it's not in the registry. So then that's like that's what I called when I was tech lead on a product or a container registry product, data corruption, because somebody would try to pull that content or try to refer to it, and you get a 404 not found. How do you know if it's 404 not found because it's about to be pushed or because it was never pushed at all?
So in your view, Wayne, would you follow that DAG from that path then? So I'm looking at this from the signature. And so what we're saying is you would have somehow gotten that signature and decide to walk the path down and find the image that signature pointing to. Where the scenario I've been looking at is that you tend to pull the image first and then check to see if it's signed.
Right. So if you push the image manifest with the subject field that has a content digest, where that content digest doesn't exist, and like say your push gets disrupted or canceled or whatever, then you have an image manifest in your registry that's pointing at some other content that doesn't exist. So then later when you go to pull that image, the image exists, but the thing it points to doesn't. So it's kind of misleading from a content discovery point of view, I think, to say to allow a manifest to exist in the registry that points at some content that isn't actually there. I think that's the reason. I don't know in terms of like calling it a Merkle tree or a DAG or whatever. Like I'm not thinking of it in those terms. I'm just thinking of it in terms of whether or not the content is there. You know, like, yeah, I don't know how to put that to words. Sorry.
Jesse, I see your hand up.
Oh, I was muted. Hey, yeah, my hand was up before too, but I had to step away. I wonder if I could just up level this and get a read in the room of where people are leaning. Like what option do we prefer? I don't see like the votes on the issue. So maybe we just get an idea.
Nobody has voted yet. I think everybody was.
Yeah, I think I went to and I saw nobody else had, so probably everybody was like, nobody's voted yet. I'm not going to be the first. I'll start in the room.
I didn't want to be the jerk who thumbs up my own issue, but like, okay,
Well, that's the thing. Bjorn, really good. Like, I did this in a Slack somewhere. I did a thumbs up. That's not enough. I just want to thank the three of you for going off and thinking so much about this and writing everything down and presenting it like this. This is really great because I think we could have just kept talking forever. So I really appreciate it, and I think a lot of people do. I'll start with a voicing an opinion, and I did last week. I kind of am leaning toward option one. I'm leaning like I understand the initial issue, and I sort of was like, well, yeah, ECR's maybe got some opinions there. I think at this point, especially, and I keep trying to do this, especially in the scope of finishing 1.1, this is an issue that exists. We don't necessarily have to have it in 1.1. If we want to keep kicking, if we want to keep working on this, we can just remove her from the milestone and keep working on this. So I think there's kind of two questions here. So for the 1.1 release, I think I'm leaning option one. Or just leave it as it is and it doesn't require change. But what do other people think?
I mean, I guess my immediate reaction there is, I think I've mentioned this in the past when we've discussed this. I don't object to that either. Like, I think it's fine to a degree. The thing I do fear a little bit is just being confusing for client authors, because increasingly the ecosystem we live in is one where people implement things not necessarily by referencing another implementation, but by referencing the spec. I mean, we've seen this with the work Wayne is doing. Has done a really good job of shaking out a lot of the edge cases or assumptions that we had that, may not necessarily, be held up in reality. So I guess like philosophically, this to me, like that almost relates to like the question of, do we have to add content length to the spec for the blob upload response, that issue that Wayne opened, of just technically that's only required by some client implementations. And not everybody is going to need that, but practically, if we're trying to give people a reference for how to build a client, do we potentially create confusion for them, or like we're holding back information of like, oh, just following the spec isn't enough, you actually have to know this externality? Or I guess, the flip side is that my fear is that like we end up in a world where clients end up with option 2 anyway, because they have to support hub and ECR. And so they have to implement the try to push first, fall back to pushing after. Like, is it essentially like, is that just a source of confusion and doesn't actually settle anything, just because in the real world, the specification isn't enough to interact with real registries?
Yeah, I think that maybe comes back to the specification versus implementation kind of discussions that we've had, right? Like I think the specification should identify and call out like what we as a body think, the behavior of a registry of a client, implied client should be. And I will say, just for posterity, Michael's here too. I mean, I would say that I mentioned currently ECR would be non-conformant. This doesn't necessarily mean we'll be non-conformant or that we forever will be non-conformant, right? I mean, maybe we just let you push whatever, and if you never push the subject image, then you get garbage collected. I don't know. I mean, I think that part of this can be really simplified to that sort of thing. So yeah. There's a lot of people here. There's a lot of people here off camera, not saying anything. I'm not calling on the class. I'm not, but I am curious, like what the general vibe in the room is on this. Maybe we should call on somebody. I mean, I guess the thing is, if we don't, I don't want to rat hole on this, but there is a bit of a like sort of week to week cadence of this call where we have an issue like this. We might want to think sometime, and maybe KubeCon's a good time to like have a side tangent about how do we deal with things where we can't reach a quorum. Like what we're doing here is we're talking about the potential of changing something that's already been litigated and written. It's already in the spec. So like, how long do we do that? What is quorum? Do we need unanimous consent? Like that might be part of this too, is like, if nobody's really willing to say, yeah, 2, we must have 2, or option 3, I'm passionately in support of, then it feels like we just don't make a change and move on. Maybe we keep the issue open, but remove it from the milestone.
So I like option 1, just to speak up here, but I think we should document the possibility of automatic transactions. So not just say no change whatsoever, but document the possibility that like registries have the option not to allow pulls of a referrer that hasn't had its referee also uploaded.
I think from my own view, when I was getting into some of the automatic transaction thoughts, that this was a prequel to knowing that we would implement transactions in like a 1.2. And so registries would still be non-conformant, but they would be non-conformant in a way that broke fewer clients.
My understanding of this is that it's not saying it's like implicit transactions. It's not saying that there are transactions. All you would have to document is that registries may not allow pulling of manifests whose referees, whose subjects haven't also been pushed. So you don't have to use the word transaction when you're documenting it. All you have to do is say registries may not allow pulling of those manifests until the full set of content has been pushed.
I mean, wouldn't that be a 404? Like, I'm trying to understand like what that would look like from the client side. Like, we don't allow it.
Yeah.
Like, we
Well,
throw
it
you
could be
back
a
a
404.
500 and you have to sort it out. Like,
You could say a 409 conflict, and you could have like a message in the API
Sure.
spec error message that says why it's a why you can't pull that image, or yeah, it could just be a 404.
I'm worried Derek is in favor of another 999 API or a PR.
Why not? I mean, maybe the best thing is just no release at all, right? Just like that's where everything's headed.
How is everything
My-
headed
my-
there?
My table is too heavy to flip. From his comments, he's talking about ripping out the entire reverse API.
No, I heard that, but why? Like, why are we headed that way? I don't know.
The lack of
Oh.
consensus is the same as a non-release in this case.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think this is like a perennial problem. Like, what is consensus? Does this mean we have to unanimously all support the same thing, or can we have quorum, or can there not be valid disputes that everybody aligns on, so we just move on? Like, I don't know why.
Well, I mean, I won't get into philosophical, but like the whole point of the working group is coming out of it, we have something that's essentially working and agreed on. But I think the working group ended a little early in this case because we might have had consensus among the working group, but maybe we didn't have the right group, or at least the right stakeholders in that case. But I mean, that's more just, you know, that led to stuff like 999 and stuff like this. But I'm not actually proposing that. I'm just saying it's like a lot of the discussions, you know, I go back through and I read the spec and I'm like, oh, the backwards compatibility API actually works better for a lot of these cases because it defines all those, at least how it's been described as the referrers being able to mutate content, something that's essentially you're mutating something that's already there, and then being able to have a strict set of referrers. Like the referrers API is, it's not my favorite. I'm not proposing ripping it out, but the fact that like it is mutable content and it doesn't necessarily define like a fixed set makes it really complicated from a client perspective. Like when can I pull it? When do I have the full set? Stuff like that. So I think there's a lot to be debated on like even after the release of how useful is it and how to use it.
Ram, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to point out, right? I mean, there is a lot of client tooling that has already implemented all of this stuff. So, and it is working for quite a few cases. So this is the last leg that needs to be sorted out. So, changing any drastic changes in direction has implications. I don't think this is necessarily a technology problem. I think it's a point where we should just say we disagree, but commit and move forward, and the consensus is far more important.
And when we say like clients might already depend on this behavior, I assume what we're referring to is that like somebody might have implemented a registry client that only knows how to push signatures before and will just be unable to push referrers to a registry that doesn't exhibit this behavior. Right?
There may be registries we can't push that content to. I already can't push that content to Docker Hub today.
See, I guess this is less productive maybe just because it doesn't actually tie to the technical implementation. But I do feel like part of the whole, like I want to push referrers before, like part of that is fundamentally some referrers are more important than others, and people want the signal to be what are the important referrers or what are the ones that were live when the content was first pushed versus what are the refers that are live later. I mean, again, I think that a lot of that concern can be addressed with tags, or however you trigger downstream jobs, whatever that method for content discovery is, because even if it's a human writing a digest in a YAML file, that's still content discovery. But I mean, it feels like, fundamentally like immutability means that this could change on the server side at any time. And so, that's kind of the rationale more than anything else behind like, I want the refers up first is I want some sort of signal that these are the important refers. These are the ones that you must have. Am I completely off base there, or would people say that that is kind of what they're thinking?
I guess I don't consider that a registry concern. I think it'll vary based on who's pulling and where they're pulling to and what policies you set up on that. Like what the important refers are will depend on what the client is looking for. There's no way for I don't think there's a clean way for a registry to start caring about that. And so I think we should, I guess I missed some of this discussion because I was out the last couple of weeks, but between option 1 and option 2, like I don't know if I necessarily understand the concern. Like I don't think you get the client simplicity that you think in option 1, and I don't know. Option 2 seems like it will also introduce some weird, like the last minute change will probably introduce additional time. But the real issue here seems like if we go option 1 and we just say maybe Docker Hub and ECR will not be conformant forever, like that is basically like going with option 2 for clients, right?
It's kind of saying that like it's hard to ignore widely used registry implementation, so client authors still have to deal with the pain. I think is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think Jesse and I've been sort of talking in the background. Like I think ECR could change. I don't know if Docker Hub, like, are we sure that is true forever? I think for ECR, it's probably, if this becomes an issue, we would change it. And maybe we would change it before we even launch. So I don't know if we're sure of that, but are we sure of that for Docker Hub? Because if we are sure of it, it seems hard to say, let's just like march forward and ignore it.
Yeah, like that's a question toward maybe Derek.
Oh, what's that? Where me answer that?
Like I'd rather make our decisions based on like, will this spec be something that is useful for people to adopt, or will it be something where
I was kind of thinking of
deal with all
Sanjay's comment about trust and stuff, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of us we think philosophically different about like OCI and stuff like that. Like from my perspective, OCI gets its legitimacy through like having the widespread adoption, like having clients do one thing but the servers don't do it makes, like that in of itself, I feel like hurts OCI. So if we release 1.1 in a way that's not widespread adopted or won't be, then to me that's much worse than like, this small group of people in this, well, it's quite a few people, but the people in this room might be more aware of kind of the back and forth, but I think the general industry isn't.
Yeah.
I guess at least like a little bit to the direct question of like, can Hub change? I mean, maybe. I don't think anything is 100% set in stone, but I would say like for purposes of discussion, my understanding is that there's simply not the engineering resources to change it on a time scale that is useful to us here. Like let's say hypothetically like year plus, although that's completely just pulled out of the aether. But from a practical standpoint, like it will be a significant amount of work to make changes to hub if that was even desired. So say we release distribution 1.1 today, there is going to be some period of time where clients will have to, I mean, it sounds like the same boat as ECR. Like, I don't think anything is set in stone, but just with resources, roadmap priorities or whatnot, clients will have to deal with the fragmentation for a significant amount of time. Where significant here is, more than weeks to months.
Seems like it shouldn't be that complicated. Oh, sorry, I'm speaking out of turn, Brandon. You've got your hand
Well,
up.
I don't want to get into that. I want to more focus on so then if we sort of take it for granted that ECR and Docker Hub will not support option 1, why would we not go to option 2? Because these content may be accessible without the associated metadata. Like that's true in the fallback. That's true today with all of these other workarounds that people have made. It's like that's not a problem. You fix that with client policies. So what are the cons of option 2 that like we really can't work around?
With the fallback scenario today, if the registry isn't looking at the subject, clients can push the signature first.
Yes, but they might not, like, the associated metadata might not exist yet. Like there's no way for clients to say, because the image is there, I know everything else is there. So
Yes.
they will always need to check.
Well, so that was what I was that was what I was kind of speculating on, is that people want to use the registry as a way to signal that some referrers are more important than others, potentially. Like that's my kind of reading the tea leaves.
So that's where my hand jumped up.
I think
the way I see this being used in practice is that I much more envision that people are going to end up pushing their container image and a bunch of the metadata with it from something like a CI pipeline. It'll get pushed up to a registry and it will appear all at once upstream. The value of refers that it can change over time. Yes, somebody could go back up and amend that existing image and change it. I think it's going to be a lot more frequently that a downstream consumer is going to ingest that image into their own local registry repository and amend it with extra data there. And that process of ingesting could also follow the similar concept of they're going to ingest it, sign it, and make it available to their internal users all in one unit as well. And having this logical structure of the data, knowing that all the metadata on it has already been pushed before you actually push that image, makes a lot of the client workflows that we've seen in the past where you push the layers before you push the manifest. The same client logic that was doing that can be used when you're pushing all the other metadata as well. And therefore it makes the client logic a lot more simple, where you can say, I see that image upstream. I see the image I have. I may have amended it, add more stuff to it, but that thing upstream didn't change. I don't need to go back through my whole business process again and re-ingest it. So I think there are going to be scenarios like that where the workflows that we've already developed in the past focused around pulling the layers first and then the manifest are going to apply much more in the design of pulling all the metadata on that image first and then pulling the image, then vice versa. And so that's why I've been favoring option 1. Ram, I see your hand jumped up.
Yeah, just to extend on that, right? So if you have a fairly complex CI pipeline where the responsibilities are somewhat distributed, for example, something computes signature, something computes CVEs, something computes something, so on and so forth, then they may all be pushing into the registry at different points of time and there's not a single owner that is pushing this. So that's also a case against transactional API, because that is realistic. So it was the responsibility. So say the CI pipeline, for example, could be go and build this from these sources, and the builder is something else that produces the images and pushes it. The signature verification, signature building could be something else. CV scanning could be something else, and they may all finish their jobs at different times. But since we know that there is this single tag or so, whatever that we want to call it, that we want to get pushed to the registry, then they will all need to get pushed at different times. And there's not a single owner because they're all happening in different potentially geographies for all you know. So they may, so the point being that they may come out of order, and that is probably the more general use case.
Well, but when we're talking about pushing out of order here, like you can't have a subject without knowing the digest, right? So I'm not 100% sure how that, like, it to me that almost feels like arguing in the case of like it doesn't make sense to push things first, push manifest first, because like you still, if I have a downstream job which is doing the SBOM at generation, it needs to know the digest of the image, not only because it needs the image to run the job, but because it needs a source for the subject field, right? And so like, and yeah, exactly, it can be pushed at any time, but I guess that is what confuses me, is because like in a world where it's distributed like that, it's harder to push the referrers first than it is to push the subject first.
Harder, but not impossible. I'm a strong proponent of the OCI layout to do a lot of this work local before you start exposing it to end users to pull. And I think a lot of other people, when they don't have that, will run an internal registry before they push the content up to a publicly visible registry.
Right, but if you have a registry or an OCI layout that you're passing around, then you have the totality. And you can, again, just like that goes back to my theory of like, you don't need to do content discovery. You don't need to inform others there's a new digest, whether it's in the form of a tag, an email, writing a digest in a YAML file, or triggering a CI job, until the subject and all the referrers that you want to be live are live. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is like, I don't in that case of like, whether it's, working offline using a local registry or whatnot, I'm just not sure that it actually has this has bearing on that workflow one way or another.
I'm not quite sure 100% follow. From users exposing their content to other people downstream, they can expose it in one unit. And also if they're ingesting it, moving it across different areas, you would know if that process finished and was complete, because you would see that digest of the image there, and you would know that all the child content was already pushed.
Right. I think what I'm trying to say is that you can do that or not do that, regardless of what we do with this must or not. Like, the world that's being described there is one where the referrers are being generated in parallel to or after. Well, I mean, definitionally after still, because you need to have the digest of the original content to use it as a subject. And, I don't think that what you can or cannot do is impacted in any way by the outcome of this issue.
I think the data consistency is. So you can absolutely generate the manifest and all the layers locally on your machine and push the manifest first and then push the layers. We don't do that though. We push the layers first and then push the manifest, just for a data consistency of what's there available on the registry for people to pull. And so,
well, but also like that's the bottom turtle, like going back to like the strong graph model of like layers are terminal nodes in the graph. They are the bottom turtle. And since the thing above them is a graph node that has to reference them, like, you need a bottom turtle with this content addressable model.
And so this is where the two sides disagree of whether or not it is a single DAG with the signature on top, or two DAGs with the image giving the client a way to discover the signature DAG. We come out with different answers to the same question. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, see, the other thing is, when you have this loose coupling, it also allows for, I mean, I'm not discussing about the security aspect of things, but it also allows for the artifacts to be located in different places, potentially, right? So your subject could be not necessarily in the same way. So when you move towards a transactional strong guarantee model, you're basically forcing a certain implementation that everything is in the same place, which is basically a centralized model, right? So that's a very strong limitation in my opinion. Again, I'm not a voting member on any of these things, so So that's what it turns out to be, right? So now if you have a body like OCI where we are saying that everything needs to work together across things, then I don't see I mean the world where you have references across registries, across different organizations. So we want to leave that door open, right? And that is probably the world we will go to eventually. And a loose coupling allows you to get there.
So that's not a door, to be clear, that's not a door we're closing because the proposed language chain is going from a must to a may. So registries are still free to do what they want. If they want to allow, quote unquote, a dangling reference, if they want to allow a subject that doesn't point to content on the same registry, they're allowed to. It's a relaxing of language, but we're not trying to invert it to say that registries must reject. We're just saying that we can go from registries must accept to registries may accept. So I would say this is similar to like sparse indexes. Is not something that the spec requires you to support, even though some registries do support a sparse index.
Does anybody that hasn't had a chance to comment yet want to jump in, or people that haven't had a chance to vote yet? And I would say everybody here that's been part of this discussion, this is not just a maintainer vote. This is, I'd love to get a temperature check of the entire community on this. Right. Otherwise, 10 minutes left. We've got other items on the agenda here, but I didn't expect we would get to them. Maybe one of the better ones to do, I think WASM and artifacts is probably going to take us longer than the 10 minutes we have left. How about the discussion on the head request, including the content length? Wayne, was this one of yours?
Yeah, I opened this last week after working with Bjorn pretty extensively in the middle of the week, trying to understand why I was getting image manifests from Docker pushed to my registry that did not include the size field in the config descriptor. Whereas, like, if you look at the OCI image spec, the descriptor always requires a size. Like, there's never a case where you should be allowed to have a descriptor without a size field in it. So, like, my registry implementation just like rejects a manifest where there's an invalid, like, missing field like that. So I was like trying to push an image, not getting any, not getting the size field, and then I couldn't Docker push images to my recently written registry. So after digging into that, we were able to infer that the reason that there is no size field in that descriptor on the image manifest that Docker was pushing to my registry is that the prior to the manifest put request, there is a blob head request to the config blob for that manifest. And my registry didn't include a content length header in the head response. So what the behavior that we inferred was that somewhere in Docker there is a it's reading that content length and it's setting the descriptor size field to whatever that is, rather than just like reading it off disk or counting the bytes it has locally, which you'd think it should have locally since it's pushing the image.
We actually do. So we do count the bytes at the same time that we calculate the digest, which of course we have the correct digest. So there's some, like, I haven't found it yet, but there's something that's clobbering that in favor of the content length that really shouldn't be there.
Okay. Yeah. So the reason that, that may be the case. I like have a hard time looking at like really complex code sometimes, and I feel like I shouldn't need to. I feel like, but I was able to infer that behavior because the descriptor serialization JSON tag on that Go struct says omit empty. So in Go, 0 value for an integer is considered empty. So it's omitting that size field because it's set to 0 when you don't get the content length, or when you don't include the content length in the head response. And the reason I'm pretty sure that it is setting the content length or setting that size field from the content length is that when I was incorrectly returning the wrong content length size or like value in my head response, it was setting the descriptor, the config descriptor size to that incorrect value. So it was like 2 bytes was the incorrect value because I was implicitly calculating the length of just like 2 double quotes in the body. So it was like counting the length of like 2 characters in my response body, which it was wrong to have a response body in the first place. But because of that, I noticed it was like, why is it saying that my config descriptor, which is 816 bytes, is only 2 bytes? And the only reason it could have been doing that is that my content length was wrong. So when I went and updated my code to actually, grab from the database the size of that particular blob, which was 816 bytes in my database, and set that to the content length, then I started getting a config descriptor size of 816 bytes. So yeah, that's how I was inferring that behavior. I still haven't seen the code. Like Bjorn said, we haven't found where it's getting clobbered from. Yeah, my proposal here is that because we have at least one major client implementation that does use the content length in this way, even though the HTTP spec specifies you should set the content length, but doesn't require it, and even though clients should not depend on it being there, I think we should document that registries should include it to accommodate a widely used registry client, so that somebody else doesn't have to go through that same process of inferring where that size field is coming from. And then, the risk of not setting that content length header, like say you have a registry implementation that doesn't strictly require that size field in the descriptor, then you have registries that are taking in incorrect manifests, and then eventually they'll be responding to GET requests with those incorrect manifests, and there'll be some other logical error in some other subsequent client downstream because there's no descriptor size field there. So yeah, it's a pretty simple addition. I feel like it shouldn't be too controversial. Although somebody did say in the comments on the PR, why should we do this? So I've tried to make a strong case here.
Yeah, I think I agree with the direction we're going. I disagree with a lot of the reasoning behind it. I just look at it of saying the RFCs explicitly call that field out of something that you may exclude, and went through a lot of extra effort to point people in that direction. And so I feel like it's nice for us to have something in the spec that goes a little different direction, saying, no, you probably should include this. While at the same time, I look at everything else from what's going on over in the Docker side and saying, there's a bug over there, it just needs to get fixed.
Yeah, but even if you fix that bug, you're still going to have older, buggy versions out in the wild that are continuing to do the wrong thing. So
yeah,
that would be my concern with saying it's just like this one client has a bug, but there are so many of those older versions that are going to continue to be used, like probably even like 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah.
So
there was a bunch of other stuff, and you're talking about changing the image spec to allow emit empty and those things. I'm going to say probably a strong no to that one. But to this one change here that you proposed, that was the one that I gave a thumbs up to. And Derek, jump in there.
Yeah, I mean, I want to figure out what the impact of that bug is in terms of where it comes from and what versions. It seems kind of weird. I mean, we've had bugs like that in the past where like the content type was getting set to like was it content or like the generic content type, just because it was using the response from the registry. My concern with deviating from the HTTP spec here is that it's pretty specific around like when content length should and shouldn't be used, whether or not you're doing having like chunked download versus like normal. So I'd be cautious about deviating from the HTTP spec there, because you could have unintended side effects where you were doing chunked transfer, now suddenly content length says that it's not a chunk transfer. So that's the only concern. And head versus get like shouldn't have a different set of headers. So if you're doing a get and you're getting chunk transfer, then really you shouldn't get that content length from the head request.
Well, so this is an existing behavior that every registry implementation has, right? So that's I mean, at least I think that like unintended consequences, at least to me, are not something I'm as worried about, because everybody already does this. This is just a normative description in the spec.
And the difference we're doing here from the RFCs is that we're just changing a may exclude to a should include. That's a very minimal, probably syntactically reads the same way depending on who you talk to. I think it just gives us a stronger signal to end users that, hey, here's a call out here that you should make sure you're doing this right.
Would it make sense when we have these shoulds? Because I think there are probably a lot of shoulds in this spec where it's like, oh, there's a client, like a big client that does it, that reads the response in this way. So when we have a should, would it make sense to have like a little like a little a footnote that says the reason we think this is a good idea, such and such, and then link to the like any related issues. Would that make sense? Or I mean, they could look at the name and then find this issue or this PR in the discussion there, but
yeah, we've done implementer notes in other places. I worry about too many of those, specifically linking them to specific implementations, just because that gets us out of being a very independent body. That's the only concern I would have with that.
okay, well, just a suggestion. They can always still use the get blame. Why is this line here? And also, I guess I don't have a lot of personal stake here, but my main concern is like being a good citizen as a participant here to help the next person that comes along and thinks, oh, maybe I should try to implement a OCI compliant registry.
Yeah, the more we can steer people in a good way, the better. Cool. I think we are at time though, so I want to be respectful of everybody that needs to drop off. And yeah, Bjorn, I think next week I'd love to have some time to talk about that whole artifact set of PRs. And hopefully we'll be done next week with the discussion on the subject digest. Fingers crossed. Thanks,
I'm trying to
everybody.
change my viewpoint of the DAG directionality there. Like thinking about it purely from the point of view of the subject is only useful for the refers API helps me think that, okay, maybe it doesn't strictly need to refer to an existing content when you push it. But then, you know, the only risk is somebody pulls that manifest, then they use the subject field in a non-compliant or like a unexpected way, and they try to get that, you know, subject.
Somehow they would have had to have that subject or that signature, whatever it is they're looking for. Somehow they would have had to find that. So that's where I'm kind of curious what path people are expecting folks to go to find that.
No, they would pull the manifest that's getting
Yeah,
pushed
but-
with the subject field, and then they
but
would
they
have
wouldn't have-
access to the subject field.
They wouldn't have
And then
queried
they
it
would
from the
say,
referrer's
"Oh."
API, so it would have been something that would have been tagged or some other way they would have found it. So it's just, it's a
they
non-traditional
would-
way to access that manifest.
Yeah, but yeah, it would be like an unexpected way to use the subject field that we
Yeah,
hadn't
so it's-
anticipated.
But where I'm going is it's not just a non-traditional way to use the subject field, but it's a non-traditional way to find the signature that has a subject field.
Gotcha.
All right. I see everybody dropping off. I think we are past time here. So have a great rest of your week, everybody.
Bye.